Hi, everyone, and welcome to a special GZERO Media live stream, Time for Nature, Turning Biodiversity Risk into Opportunity. I'm Shari Friedman, Managing Director of Climate and Sustainability at Eurasia Group. This program is presented in partnership with Suntory Holdings and the Sustainability Leaders Council, which Eurasia Group and Suntory co-founded last year to bring together global leaders from multilateral institutions, governments, and the private sector. And the goal is to create blueprints for action around environmental sustainability. Today, over the next 90 minutes, we'll bring to you discussions with some of the world's foremost experts on sustainability, environmental policy, and corporate sustainability. We're going to talk specifically about biodiversity in nature and explore the urgency of biodiversity loss, what it means for the world, and then dive into the relevance to the private sector, how they will be affected in the many ways that finance and industry can play a role in creating the solutions. I'd like to welcome our first panel. Barrett is the Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Ian Bremmer is the founder and president of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media. Niinami is the CEO of Suntory Group, and Kathleen McLaughlin is Walmart's Executive Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer, as well as President of the Walmart Foundation. Welcome to you all. So, let's start with you. We are on the brink of a sixth mass extinction. It's very serious. What can you tell us about this biodiversity emergency?
Well, let me just start by saying that, biodiversity refers to the enormous variety and variability of life on Earth in all its forms, at all levels, within species, between species, and of ecosystems. And it's being lost at an unprecedented rate. This is particularly worrisome because biodiversity provides the natural resilience the Earth requires to survive distress. If one species succumbs to disease or stress, a biodiverse ecosystem adapts and continues to thrive. So you can understand that biodiversity is essential for the natural world, but it's also critical for human livelihoods as it supports food production, climate stabilization, and the purification of drinking water. Because of its breadth and depth, biodiversity is a difficult concept to understand, appreciate, and measure, but I find the concept of planetary boundaries helpful in getting it. That is, that our planet has limits that can be assessed through science-based methods to define the environmental limits within which humanity can safely operate. And if you look at those, out of the 9 boundaries that are assessed, the 2 biodiversity-specific ones are among the most at risk and have already crossed their threshold. And this is ushering in a new ecological era that poses existential threats to humans, species, and businesses. Reducing biodiversity loss to maintain a viable, livable planet for future generations is really crucial. But this will require transformational change and collective action from both governments and the private sector.
So, you're on the Intergovernmental Panel, the co-chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which for most people know is the biggest scientific body on climate change. It comes out with the scientific pieces that everybody follows in the scenarios and has identified the 1.5 degree limit of global warming. And I'm wondering how what you're seeing in biodiversity converges with what you're seeing on climate. What is that interrelation between the two?
Yeah, our reports find that biodiversity and climate are deeply intertwined. It will actually not be possible to solve one crisis without addressing the other. Climate change accelerates biodiversity loss, while biodiversity offers clear solutions to tackle climate change. So on one hand, climate change is increasingly disturbing freshwater, marine, and terrestrial ecosystems. In fact, 1/8 of the millions of animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction, more than ever before in history. And we found that global wildlife populations have plummeted by as much as 70% since 1970. On the other hand, nature-based solutions such as green roofs to cool buildings, preserving bee populations to improve crop yields, or mangroves to store carbon can help ramp up climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts while protecting biodiversity. Land and oceans, for instance, can absorb more than 50% of all carbon emissions if ecosystems remain balanced and intact. So this shows that biodiversity and climate change should be tackled simultaneously. Failing to do so risks leading to unintended and negative consequences for one or the other. And that's why 196 nations are currently gathered in Montreal for the UN Biodiversity Summit. They're trying to secure an agreement to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 and fully restore it by 2050.
Thank you. And I think a lot of what you're saying kind of leads into my next question, which I'm going to direct over to Ian. Biodiversity has historically really been viewed as like an environmental justice or something that we focus on for the benefit of wildlife. But this conversation, as I think really outlined, has shifted in the last couple of years. And Ian, can you talk a little bit about what makes biodiversity in nature an economic issue with material impacts on businesses and people's livelihoods?
Well, it's starting to shift. And of course, like so many of these conversations, it's shifting late. Co already sort of dropped a bit of this data, but I remember 3 years ago in 1969, in 2019, when I turned 50, it struck me as the biggest story of my lifetime that there was less than half as much animal life on Earth at that point than when I was born. In just 50 years, the fact that humanity has managed to do that to the planet, on the one hand, it's existentially depressing, but on the other hand, you have to think it's going to have a snapback function on the human beings and the economy that we rely on. And of course, that's what we're now seeing. We are seeing that as the world is converting so much land for productive use for human beings, that nature is being short-term productive use for human beings, that nature is being squeezed into tiny corners. And what that means is that biodiversity is increasingly understood to be material for businesses and for the investors that rely on them. And so that's why biodiversity is increasingly seen as an economic and financial issue. Half of the world's GDP, so roughly $44 trillion, is generated through sectors that are understood clearly to be either moderately or highly dependent on nature. Okay, this is not the digital world by itself. And the consequences are very clear for businesses across the entire supply chain. Production costs are going to increase, profitability is going to drop, prices are going to have to go up for end consumers. Inflation is going to go up. And we've been talking a lot because of TAC and I co-chairing this about the Asia Pacific region. Actually, those numbers are higher for Asia Pacific. Some 63% of the region's GDP, almost 20 trillion, is directly at risk from biodiversity loss. And there are really three types of risks to companies out there: physical, transition, and then systemic. The physical risks are fairly straightforward. They're the direct result of a company's dependencies on biodiversity that result in disrupted supply chains and input scarcity. Then you've got transition risks that occur more broadly when companies don't understand how quickly the world is changing and social views are changing, which will cause brand damage, reputational risk, stranded assets, you name it. And then finally, and most concerningly, of course, you have systemic risks, which occur when events like the sixth mass extinction cause the entire system to break down. And then you get large-scale disruption and social crises that companies are not prepared for. And all of this is why companies or investors are in Montreal this week attending the UN Biodiversity Summit. It's going to wrap up next week. It's by far the largest biodiversity COP in history. It's got 20,000 participants. The last only had 4,000. And I think that you can see that this interest can be explained by the momentum to bring the private sector target that's being negotiated at the Montreal COP right now. It's target 15 in the draft agreement. If it's adopted, and I think we all on the call here really hope it is, it's going to force businesses to disclose their biodiversity impacts and the dependencies across their supply chain. And the point here is very simple. Just like with climate change, more broadly, just like with carbon and methane in the atmosphere, you can't fix a problem, you can't start to address a problem unless first you measure it. And that's where we are with the impact of biodiversity on the planet. That's where we are with the impact of biodiversity on corporations and the global economy. So it is an important, it's a tipping point really for response to biodiversity when the world has already hit the tipping point for the global economy.
Mhm.
Thanks, Ed. I think that, as you're describing these broad trends and how they're going to trickle down over into individual companies, we now have the opportunity to turn over to Suntory and Walmart and see how this is actually playing out and what you guys are looking at specifically. So let's go first to talk. And why is biodiversity and these trends that both Co and Ian have outlined, how does this manifest in a company like Suntory? What's important and what are you keeping your eye on?
Beverages companies like us, Suntory, greatly dependent on nature to do business. We rely on the water and agriculture to provide the raw materials for the products we sell. Biodiversity loss endangers raw materials and disrupt our supply chain, threatening the continuity of business. That is why Suntory puts nature at the core of our corporate philosophy, with our mission to create harmony with people and nature. To us, nature positive is not just about taking action to deliver tangible and positive outcomes for nature, but also about ensuring that our business can coexist with nature in a positive way for the long term. For example, Suntory Group has been dedicated to water conservation for nearly 2 decades through natural water sanctuary initiatives, which started in Japan. We have expanded the area of our preservation efforts to 12,000 hectares and achieved water positive by recharging more than double the amount of groundwater used in our plants in Japan. We have also expanded regenerative agriculture and recently launched pilot projects with the local barley farmers in the UK and corn growers in US. However, in order to accelerate our progress toward the nature positive, it is important to have a clear understanding of our dependencies on nature and measure the extent of our impact. Further, since the actions required to address nature loss are often more localized, mainstreaming nature positive actions will also require sound knowledge of the local context and a high level of customization to specific settings. For a lot of businesses, this is not a matter of short-term survival, but of long-term survival.
So you had mentioned regenerative agriculture and some of the solutions that you're starting to take a look at. And there's a lot of talk about this concept of nature positive, and it's kind of viewed as many as the net zero for biodiversity. So could you talk a little bit about what nature positive means to you and how you're thinking about that in the context of your company?
Well, I think we saw on the climate side of the Paris Agreement, we cannot manage what we cannot measure. So nature positive is working together with the climate change together. And as Cole talked about, as Ian talked about, it's both sides of coin. And the nature positive is everything, because we have to pass this beautiful nature to the next generation to come. We don't have any right to destroy the nature, and we have to keep it. And we have to make business as a business leader, but how we can make use of nature, not destroying, and contribute to society and make business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so not only, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, so not only to do no harm, but also then to start to have an additional benefit as a company and as a corporation.
Exactly. So corporations have lots of know-how, and know-how should be used to nurture nature, such as growing the forest and regenerate the natural water instead of just using it. So we corporate should take that responsibility. Nature positive is not the nature neutral. Nature positive is additional value for us to create for the generation to come, next generation to come.
Thank you. And so I think that, when we think about Suntory, it's super clear how I think that you've outlined very well how nature affects Suntory and how Suntory can affect nature. I'd like to move over to Kathleen for a second, because it feels like while a beverage company is very clearly linked in terms of the water needs and in terms of the ingredient needs, it may not be so clear for a company like Walmart, that it may not be so clear how biodiversity and nature is really affecting and how Walmart can have an effect. So Kathleen, I'd love to hear from you on how you're looking at this in a retail sense for a company like Walmart.
Yes, well, thank you. And, as Ian and Co and TAC have so clearly laid out, what we're talking about with respect to nature is a pervasive secular risk, is probably even the wrong word. It's a phenomenon that affects all of us on the planet, and addressing the loss of ecosystems really is as critical and imperative as addressing climate. And, as you said, Co, you can't solve one without the other. So it really affects all of us. And for a retailer like Walmart, we derive really the bulk of our sales from products that ultimately originate in nature. So they go back to a forest, a grassland, an ocean, especially our food products, but even commodities like cotton. So there is relevance to our assortment and the surety of supply of future commodities and products. And then, of course, tremendous relevance to our customer communities around the world, our associate communities and so on. And so, what started to happen, as Ian has said, is the business community has woken up and taken notice of this. And really, I'd say kind of 3-4 years ago, we started to look at it and consider how could we engage our own suppliers in actions that can better manage commodity production in critical landscapes, and then also conserve and play a role in restoration. And that's really, you asked about what is nature positive. That's really what it means. It's recognizing we need to restore aspects that have been degraded, as well as conserve and better manage production. So, for us, we took a look at our assortment and just grossly estimated, where is it coming from in terms of source ecosystems, and set out goals for our suppliers to engage and for us to engage with them through business and through philanthropy to protect, restore, and better manage 50 million acres of land and 1 million square miles of ocean, which represents the volume that it takes to supply the food and other products that our customers enjoy around the world. And, we see our role as being able to take something that is a global aspiration around climate or nature and connect it into very practical actions that businesses can take to adjust our methods of production, our operating models, in concert with civil society, in concert with governments, local communities, and so on, to rewire the methods of production and the way products get produced and even how they get consumed, to achieve the goals that we need to achieve collectively as a society for decarbonizing supply chains, for example, restoring nature, but also do it in a way that supports livelihoods of producers and still provides affordable products to consumers. So that's really how we've come at it.
Right. So I think it's interesting. One of the things that you're saying is that you're asking the questions down your supply chain. And that's one of the ways that, as somebody on the panel had said, you're trying to create transparency inside of this. And you talked a lot about solutions and looking at how you can be part of the solutions. Could you just take a second and give an example of what that might look like?
Sure. So we created a platform that we call Project Gigaton back in 2017, when we set our science-based target for emissions reduction in the supply chain. And it sets out the 6 major transitions that we believe our business needs to make in supply chains to essentially achieve net zero on climate. And it turns out, as Co pointed out, many of those transitions are also what's needed to help restore nature. And so those 6 transitions are energy, transportation, product design. So you can think of designing a product, laundry detergent that can be used in cold water instead of hot water, for example, reduces emissions in product use, or Energy Star is a common example. Packaging reduction, waste reduction, especially in food systems where we know about 30% of the food that gets produced, which is a draw on nature, gets wasted. So eliminating that is a massive lever. And then finally, of course, nature, which we have defined as regenerative agriculture, engaging in forest conservation and restoration and better management practices for the production of paper goods and so on, ocean health, ocean interactions, and then freshwater systems. So what we've done is we attract people more. We work with the scientists who advise us, folks from WWF and TNC and EDF and WRI and so on, Conservation International, to translate the science into very specific practices and KPIs, key performance indicators, that our suppliers, category by category, can work on, and then we can support in various ways. So for example, in the beef chain, very specifically, what are the practices at the grazing stage that can restore soil health, pollinator health, promote restoration of native grasses, prevent nutrient runoff into freshwater systems, very practical steps that good ranchers take anyway to drive their business to support their yields and the quality of their beef and have tremendous benefits for nature. Similarly in produce, integrated pest management, very important set of practices around pollinator health. Tuna. We have a project where we're working with the Republic of Marshall Islands and the Nature Conservancy to create a fishery in the Marshall Islands for the first time, their own fishery that they're participating in directly. It's jobs for local citizens and a very high standard in terms of the fishing and the processing and so on, environmentally and socially. And then they're taking a portion of their profits locally and reinvesting it in coastal restoration. So you're getting regeneration of the seascape, high quality tuna. And that tuna is supplying our great value brand tuna, which is our affordable opening price point tuna, very important source of protein for customers. So, again, you're getting economic benefits, environmental benefits, social benefits. So through our platform, Project Gigaton, we have 4,500 suppliers who are engaged in identifying these practices, pursuing them, reporting on the changes, reporting on the impact for emissions. We help them do that. And the 4,500 have been delivering 574 million metric tons of emissions reduction in global supply chains. That's about 70% of our supplier base that's covered on a revenue basis. We now have 520 of them engaged specifically on the nature actions, and we're ramping that up. And as I said, we've lined it out for beef and produce and row crops and so on, just to make it easier for not only the big suppliers, but the small suppliers to get engaged in practical ways that make a difference.
Mm-hmm. This has been really interesting. I mean, what I'm hearing is that we have this huge problem, which I think has been well discussed. And we're seeing that there are some solutions. They're very interesting solutions. It's going to take a refocusing. It's going to take a transparency. It's going to take a different type of incentives, but these solutions are out there. And so I'd like to say thank you to our panel, Co Barrett, Ian Bremmer, Niinami, Kathleen McLaughlin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Up next, my colleague, Frank Magali, is going to take a deeper look at the role of the financial industry and how that's playing in terms of sustainability and how it's becoming an increasingly important factor in terms of investing. But first, ahead of the program, we asked members of the Sustainability Leaders Council to share some thoughts on biodiversity and how it affects their business. And here's what some of them had to say.
Biodiversity risk is a major concern because different industries rely on natural capital. We also anticipate that the reporting of nature-related financial metrics will become more prevalent after the TNFD guidelines are released, and such reporting may start to become mandatory in some jurisdictions. Besides, businesses in the region will be motivated as nature is increasingly seen as a source of competitiveness.
In the Asia and Pacific region in particular, rapid economic development and urbanization have resulted in a serious biodiversity degradation due to the expansion of agricultural land and increase in plastic waste, etc. For JBIC, the negative impact on the Asia and Pacific countries, which are its important clients, is a serious problem that will lead to an increase in the credit risks.
On the surface, biodiversity is seemingly less of an issue than net zero for investment business in Japan and Korea. But if you look at the supply chain of our portfolio company, many rely on imported raw materials from overseas. Coffee beans, wheat, sugar, food oil, just to name a few. It is critical for these businesses to be able to secure access to this material input.
We have a great responsibility to conserve biodiversity. Also, the level of required standards for disclosure and initiatives are increasing in recent years, which can also be a business risk. However, unlike climate change, biodiversity is a regional issue. We need to establish a group-level management system as soon as possible.
Hi everyone, I'm Frank Bagudi, member of the Energy, Climate and Resources team with Eurasia Group. You're watching a special GZERO live stream on the urgent need to protect biodiversity and the impact it has on both economies and industries. Our next conversation today focuses specifically on finance and investing, and we have invited an all-star panel, which also happens to be an all-female panel, to join us. Ingrid Kukulian is the head of Impact and Sustainable Investing and the lead portfolio manager of the Biodiversity Fund with Federated Hermes. Dr. Vian Sharif is the head of sustainability at FNZ Group and the founder of Nature Alpha. Both are great platforms for investors. And last but not least, we have Katie Critchlow, who is the CEO of Nature Metrics. Welcome to you all, ladies. Unfortunately, Eva Meyerhofer, who is the head of Environment Policy Unit with the European Investment Bank, is under the weather at the moment, and she will not be able to join us today. So without further ado, let's get started. Ingrid, I would like to start with you. All of us are actually here in Montreal, and we've been attending many panels and sessions at COP15, the UN Biodiversity Cup. Ian in the previous panel said we have 20,000 people here. That's 5 times more than the previous COP. And when you think about it, the main difference is really this massive arrival and presence from the private sector and especially from financial institutions. So I would like to ask you, what opportunities concretely are there for investors to contribute to positive outcomes for nature?
Morning, everyone, and thank you for having me, Frank. There are plenty of opportunities, but first we have to start. And what I mean by this is that the investors have largely been absent from nature financing of any kind. I mean, if you look at the gap that we are facing, it's about $800 billion, and this gap needs to be closed. Majority has been financed by governments, and if we don't start mobilizing private capital, we're going to have an issue. And you have opportunities across all asset classes, you know, from private assets to public markets, but we believe that it's crucial that we act in public markets. And the reason for this is that some of the biggest culprits to biodiversity loss are to be found in the public market. So active asset management is key here, and active funds need to step up. Second thing where there is a big opportunity is with engagement. What we have found in our work with companies is that they don't routinely take into account biodiversity either as part of their risk management or strategic decision. So there is a big educational part to do. We have been trying to help corporates understand their impacts and dependencies on nature. And then the great thing about nature is obviously that you can act across all the sectors because it touches everything. So plenty of opportunities. We just need to start mobilizing private capital into this space.
Which is something that, when you think about it, Federated has been trying to do for a long time right now. You've launched your Biodiversity Equity Fund not too long ago. Can you tell us a little bit what was the rationale behind that launch?
So the main rationale was probably stemming from our work, from our engagement work. So we have been engaging on biodiversity for a number of years now. And similar to what I mentioned before, we found that, it's such a big systemic risk to the global economy from so many points of view, from land degradation, the big factor on the S. We see biodiversity as the best proxy for the S. And we decided we need to do something. We need to start putting capital, and actually we should showcase our work and, show asset owners what's going on and to get a capital. It was interesting. So when we started thinking about it, the first thought was obviously a transition fund, given how few companies take into account biodiversity. But then when we dug into the work, and actually there is a great true cost analysis that shows you that less than 1% of the global market cap takes into account SDG 14 or 15, we changed our strategy and we said, let's focus on biodiversity champions. Let's find those companies that are really trying to, preserve nature, provide innovative solutions. And we were very fortunate that we launched the fund in collaboration with the Natural History Museum. So we had access to their scientists. They're actually, as the director of the Natural History Museum likes to say, we are a research organization with a museum on the side. They have 300 scientists. And we spent 2 years analyzing all the relevant subsectors across our 6 teams to make sure that we only allocate capital to those companies that are providing innovative solutions. Another thing is that we also map the companies to UN SDGs. And this is, a fact that not many people know, but if we don't get the biodiversity right, we are not going to get the UN SDG targets and goals right, because 80% of UN SDGs depend on biodiversity.
So Ingrid, that's kind of like the good side and kind of like the bit of the success story of the biodiversity equipment from inception all the way up until now. Yes. Can you give me maybe one example of a big obstacle that you've been facing since the launch of the fund?
You're probably expecting me to tell you metrics. Wasn't a big obstacle. What we think it's a big excuse. I mean, there is a lot of data out there, as Katie will surely speak about as well. We decided to focus. So we have a proprietary impact database that we have been using for our impact strategies already. And we have decided to focus on 4 KPIs that we believe are key to biodiversity and that are widely available. And that's waste, water, deforestation, and emissions. And the focus on emissions was obviously, taking into account those companies that have targets to 2030, not to 2050. So that wasn't an obstacle. I would say the biggest obstacle was actually the education of the asset owners and trying to, attract the capital into this space and explain, because there is no knowledge and, which way do you turn, We told them very clearly, look, this is one area where you need to do stock picking. So just to give you some idea, out of the whole of the MSCI global market cap, according to our criteria, and obviously we put very high criteria, our watch list is less than 150 companies. So, out of almost 8,000 companies, that's not many. And the second thing is, so we don't believe that ETFs work in this space. And second thing is the engagement part. And we have been engaging a lot, trying to start, it's not even, there's a lot of talk, biodiversity offsets, where do we start? We should just start with baby steps, and baby step means avoidance. And if we do that, it's already going to be, a big benefit to biodiversity, to reversing biodiversity loss. So those are the main obstacles.
Thanks, Ingrid. That engagement part and that steep learning curve in terms of education around biodiversity is something that I know is very central to the work that Vian is doing. And I know that a lot of the risk related to the biodiversity conversation has been on this topic of, if people are not doing things the right way, we are increasing the risk of greenwashing. The topic of greenwashing has dominated headlines this year, especially with regards to climate and greenhouse gas emissions. So Vian, I'd like to ask you, how can we ensure that this new investor focus that we're seeing on biodiversity will not turn into a large-scale greenwashing exercise?
I mean, that is such a great question, Frank. And we've seen the investment industry start to really scrutinize the way that it's reporting on various aspects of the sustainability characteristics of its investments. And the regulator has put pressure on the investment management industry to do so too. And I think that the way forward, and I think that the investment managers are absolutely striving for this. You've seen it in some of the approaches that we've heard just now. How do we make sure that there's as much transparency as possible through to the underlying data? How do we make sure that we're using rigorous sources that are either scientifically peer reviewed or they're drawing from golden sources of information around this area? We know that biodiversity is going to be complex in terms of how it's measured and reported. We're in a very nascent phase right now. This is right at the start of the journey. You have incredible leaders like Hermes who have thought long and hard about how their process will work and documented that. Really, many investors are at the start of that journey, and the capacity building around the subject alongside transparency in the metrics is going to be key as this evolves.
I like this last one on metrics because it allows me to have the perfect segue to my question to Katie. So I'm turning to you, Katie, to kind of like walk us through the practicality aspect of it all. Tons of conversation about metrics. Both Vian and Ingrid hinted at it. I'm seeing everything here at COP15. Some people are saying we don't have enough. Some people are saying we have too many. We don't even know how to navigate that space. Some people are saying the data quality is not there. Some people are saying this is all an excuse and a cop-out to not act today. So as Tack said in the previous panel, we cannot manage what we cannot measure. So can you tell us how are technologies such as eDNA that you're working on, that is kind of like getting a lot of traction here in Montreal, transforming the way that we account for nature in financial decision making?
Yes, so my company, Nature Metrics, we use eDNA, and that's all the DNA that's left behind in the environment by every species, because every species in the world contains DNA. And one of the issues we've had with biodiversity is that lots of people think of biodiversity as being just the wild birds and mammals, the beautiful things that we can see. And that's just a tiny, tiny fraction of total life on Earth, which is microbes and fungi and nematodes and all sorts of other things. And they're actually the things that drive business risk, that drive the nutrient cycles and the carbon cycles and basically keep us all alive. And so we need to be able to measure those things at a site level where companies have a really big impact. And that's what we do. We do site level up. And we believe that by tracking the complexity of nature on a site and then simplifying up to some simple metrics that can then be passed on to investors or supply chain buyers, we can get a very meaningful simplification of what nature is. But I've also heard lots and lots of talk at the COP, as you say, both sides. Like, there's not enough data, and there's also too much data. And I think what people mean is we actually do have enough data for the investors and the asset managers to go out and start to look at where are the risks. And that's what Vian's group does really well. You know, am I near a protected area? Where are the real biodiversity hotspots? What are the sorts of things that I need to be looking out for? And there's lots of different platforms that are emerging. There was a great article by PwC earlier in the week to say that nature tech and the people that are putting nature data out there has outperformed even climate tech in terms of investment from the VC side over the last 9 months. So there has been an explosion of people trying to get this data that's already out there into the hands of people that need it. And so start somewhere. There is lots of data, but then once you understand where your high risk assets are, that's where you need to be encouraging your assets to manage biodiversity at a site-based level. And that's how things like eDNA and bioacoustics can really help.
So that's a very kind of like helpful way, especially for people joining us today, to figure out and to understand that there are options to kind of get the job started today. What would you say on your end when it comes to eDNA is the main obstacle? Would you agree with Ingrid that it's just, you know, making sure that people are aware that it exists and that these tools are available? Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, a lot of biodiversity policy making, standards, regulation have been built thinking we can't measure biodiversity, so we need to come up with some proxies or frankly, as many of the companies that I worked for in the past, we can't measure it, so we can't manage it. And that's just not the case anymore. There's very good technology like eDNA, and there's lots of others as well that can measure biodiversity at scale in a comprehensive way. It's just that, and you know, some of the leading companies, some of the companies that we're working with on the ground are doing that, seeing huge benefits, both from just simplifying and scaling up their regulatory monitoring, but then also being able to go that one step further and tell a great story about what's on their site and how they're managing that. And that's been very motivating for their employees. It's been something, you know, nature is a heart as well as a head issue, and we found wonderful stories where some of our, for example, our mining clients have found things they didn't know existed on the site, and then they've actually done something about it. They've talked to their employees, they've talked to the businesses around their own site, because biodiversity isn't something that respects borders. And so actually the more and more we can get companies working together across whole landscapes, the better. And that has led to a real sort of motivation and positivity, as well as getting their metrics right that they can report up for things like TNFD and that sort of thing coming down the line.
Thank you very much, Katie. I want to ask you all the exact same question. Since we're all here in Montreal for COP15, what do you expect to get out of this COP? And I will maybe start with you, Ian, because you've attended many panels, many sessions, you're interacting with a lot of people on the ground. What do you expect to get out of this UN Biodiversity Summit?
If I were to say one thing, it's the involvement of the finance sector as a stakeholder in this discussion. It's been extraordinary to see the integration of the finance sector into this debate. It's many of us around this table, I think, have been translators from different stakeholders to others, whether that be science to business, in terms of what Katie's doing, incredible work, in terms of how business is understanding how to incorporate these elements, as in the case of Hermes' work, and then how that fits into the policy framework and what's the role of the finance sector as we move forward, if we are to look at what's coming out of the negotiations, specifically around integration of biodiversity into mainstream business decision-making. That is huge.
That would be a game changer. I agree with you. Ingrid, over to you. What do you expect to get out of this COP?
I would agree with Ian. The support of the finance industry here has been overwhelming, and I actually didn't expect to see so many people here. So that's really positive. My wish list is one, and this is that we see some remodeling of the subsidy systems, because I think this is key, given, you know, what the big negative contribution they have to biodiversity, 1.8 trillion per annum. That's on my wish list. And regulation. We need to see regulation, because as we know, many will not move until it's regulated. So those are the two things that are on my wish list. And I think the finance industry will follow with that. But remodeling of the subsidies is key.
And you just touched on two big topics from the current global biodiversity framework that is being negotiated and discussed at the moment. So I guess we'll find out in the next few days. Katie, over to you. What do you expect to get out of this COP?
Yeah, so I mean, I think everyone's really hoping for that sort of big North Star of nature positive, which really means halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. But I feel in many ways really positive that whether we get that big commitment from governments or not, from all the businesses and financial sector institutions that we've spoken to, it feels like that's starting to happen, whether or not we get the commitment. I think the reason why the commitment is important, because there's got to be some governance around that. The nature positive has got to be a North Star. We can't start to just plant a tree and say we're nature positive. And I think that's, whilst there's a huge amount of momentum, having that governance and then being working towards, you know, what that really means and how we measure it will be really, really important. And yeah, looking forward to Nature Metrics playing a big part in that.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. Thank you, Vian. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you for joining me today for this first panel on financial institution. We will, now that we have the investor side of the story, we will move to businesses. How can companies move the needle on biodiversity and eventually become, as Kathy mentioned, nature positive? That's the topic of our final panel coming up in just a moment. But first, here are a few more thoughts on biodiversity and business from members of our Sustainability Leaders Council, the SLC.
Biodiversity risk is one of the big challenges that we face, and we will be continuing to hold discussions and to share best practices about concrete actions that businesses in Asia can take to address the issues involved. We will also contribute to research in order to share with the public about the kinds of issues of focus and also shed light on business leaders' views on sustainability and biodiversity.
We have been voluntarily measuring and disclosing the water consumption at operating companies, water consumption in areas of high water stress, and the amount of waste discharged every year. We would like to utilize this data to develop strategies and countermeasures for managing biodiversity.
We have started working with India-based venture with technology to recycle waste into alternative fuel there by circulating existing material back to the use in the society. We are attempting not only to invest with the capital from Japan, but also bring technology partners who can help these ventures roll out their business with appropriate equipment and technology to execute the rollout of their service in India.
Accelerating nature positive actions requires a substantial amount of funding, which cannot be covered by public sector alone. Therefore, it is necessary to promote the mobilization of private funds. Bankability is one of the problems in mobilizing private funds to nature positive actions. Blended finance would be one possible solution to this problem. In addition to finance, innovation is also key to accelerating nature positive. Biodiversity is an issue that spans a wide range of sectors, including energy, forestry, and agriculture. Therefore, cross-sector partnerships are important. JVIC would like to strengthen its effort toward nature positive through domestic, international, and cross-sector discussions such as today's event.
And we are back. For those of you just joining us, I am Frank Bagidi with Eurasia Group, and we're talking about the impact of biodiversity on business, on industries, and on the economy. For our final discussions today, I am now joined by Emily Mackenzie, the Technical Director of the TNFD, which is a task force on nature-related financial disclosures. I am also joined by Magali, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer with Holcim. I'm joined by Ro, the CEO of the International Council on Mining and Metal, the ICMM. And last but not least, I am joined by Anthony Waterbain, who is the Chief Sustainable Officer from Indorama Ventures, joining us very late your time. So we really appreciate you, Anthony. Welcome to you all. Ro, I'm going to start with you. We often talk about the negative impact of companies on biodiversity, but what about the potential for positive actions? What role can the mining sector play in that regard?
Frank, it's a great question. And before I share 3 ways in which we can have a positive impact, let me first say that our first and primary responsibility as all businesses, but particularly the mining industry, is about avoiding and limiting our negative impact. Like all of you, I'm sure, I am completely intolerant to greenwashing. And so I would hate for anybody to think that because I'm talking about the potential for positive impact, we've forgotten that certainly in our business, we make a real impact on the ground. And our first responsibility has to be to minimize and avoid that impact as much as possible. But once we've done that, and we've done everything possible to minimize our negative consequences, it behooves us to really look at how we can make a positive difference to get to nature positive. So there are 3 ways, Frank, really, that our industry has been working to make a positive impact. And Kathleen talked about the importance of both conservation and restoration, and those are the 2. So let me just talk about conservation to begin with. For us, we have the opportunity to use both the land holdings that we have, and then in partnership with others, an even bigger amount of land to put it into conservation. And here I must say it's got to be responsible. Can't just be fences and fines, although in some cases that may be appropriate. So a great example here would be Vale, the Brazilian mining company. They on their own conserve about 1 million hectares of land just on their own. That represents 12 times as much land as they disturb. And then what they've done is they've joined up with other large Brazilian businesses to then conserve or rehabilitate 4 million hectares. So that's a huge amount of land that they're able to directly conserve or do it in partnership with others. So that's conservation. The second one is restoration. And here, of course, for us, it's about restoring areas that we have already mined. A good example here is the Yarra forest in Australia, where Alcoa, a aluminium company, has been mining bauxite. And they set themselves a goal that within 15 months, so just over a year, within 15 months of stopping mining activity, they want the area to get to the same reference level of species as what would have existed before they started mining. 15 months is not long, and yet they're able to do that because they've been at this for over 50 years. So that's an example of how restoration has to be a major focus. And the third area is on disclosures and data. And here, we just heard from Katie about the importance of eDNA. So a great example is Anglo American that runs this Woodsmith project for fertilizer in the UK, where they're using eDNA techniques to understand species in the area. And once they understand what species there are in the area, they change their mining plan to make sure it doesn't disturb those species. So what they're finding actually is that through eDNA, taking samples of water, species that they thought were extinct, that didn't exist in that area, actually do exist. And so the mine plan never accounted for it because our existing data showed that those species didn't exist. Now that we know they exist, the mine plan has been changed to accommodate those. And the best part is they're going to make 30,000 of those data points available on the atlas that's run by the IUCN for everybody to use. So Frank, 3 ways to make a positive impact: conservation, restoration, data.
That's super clear, also. Thanks for sharing those concrete examples also from like specific companies so that people can really see and visualize for themselves what can be done and what is also already being done on the ground. I do want to know, I guess, from your perspective, the industry-wide perspective, what can be done as a whole, I guess, to move the needle, particularly in terms of your engagement with policymakers. What do you see, I guess, as the #1 thing that you're trying to push?
#1 thing we're trying to push is to get the words nature positive into the global biodiversity framework. And Frank, I don't know what you're hearing on the ground here in Montreal, but it doesn't sound like that's going to happen. So we've been engaging as much as we possibly can with negotiators to say, get it into the framework, please. And of course, agree target 15. And that's why, Frank, about a month ago, we wrote an open letter to governments because, and let me just call a spade here, there are some business organizations that have been actively working against ambitious action at COP15. We are not one of them. We have been saying, listen, if you are worried about agreeing an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework because you think it'll be bad for business and you think it'll be bad for mining, we got news for you. We want you to be ambitious. We want you to agree a really clear goal on nature for business. And we are right there behind you. So Frank, the big thing I think we can do as the industry that's often seen as maybe acting, in a way that would want the goal to be less ambitious is to come out really strongly and say, no, we are 100% with you. Because as Ian said in his opening, half the world's GDP depends on the thriving nature. Well, man, I can tell you, our industry depends 100% on nature. We are a fully nature-based industry. So we want governments to be ambitious.
A very clear call to action, Will. Thank you so much. And actually, many of your members are working very closely with the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, to build, I guess, that template for disclosures moving forward. Good segue to my question to Emily. How is the TNFD supporting businesses to chart that path towards what Ro mentioned, towards nature positive? How are you helping to make it happen?
Thank you, Frank, and thanks everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Like many of us, I'm here in Montreal, where there's tremendous interest and I've been somewhat overwhelmed by the level of interest and uptake of the TNFD framework. So what we are providing to help businesses and financial institutions is developing a risk management and disclosure framework for nature-related risks. It is being developed by the task force, so it is a market-led initiative with 40 members. working closely with our forum members. We now have over 800 organizations, and it's growing every day, of organizations from across the world, including in Asia, from all walks of life, that are supporting the task force in developing that framework, as well as with our knowledge partners who bring the science organizations and the standards organizations to help make sure what we're developing is credible and science-based and also practical to implement. Why are we doing this? It's this recognition that's coming from the market, driven from the market, that nature-related risks and opportunities are material and the market wants to take action. So we're developing that framework. We're moving rapidly. It's already quite well developed. We've had, following what we call an open innovation approach. So being very open, moving swiftly, putting out material as the framework develops every 3 months. We've already done 3 iterations. And our final, what we call beta release, will come out in March next year, which will give the market a sense of the full coherent framework. And then the final version 1 will be published in September next year. And we're doing all of this through a process of open innovation. So organizations can provide us feedback via our online platform at any time. And also doing pilot testing. And it's wonderful to follow my colleague Ro, because ICMM has been one of our pilot program partners doing pilot testing with the mining and metal sector. We have others from all regions and many sectors providing us now input through pilot testing, which enables us to learn by doing and achieve that practical framework. And at the core of the framework are 3 things: a set of definitions and concepts so that we can create that common language system for understanding nature-related impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities. Just like we have for climate, I think there's a need for this shared language so that we can all take action on the same understanding. There is also an assessment approach, which we have called LEAP. Follows 4 phases of locating your interface with nature, evaluating your impacts and dependencies, assessing your risks and opportunities, and then preparing to respond and report. So it's not just about disclosure, which is an important tool for action, but also about reflection on strategy, and then setting targets and measuring performance against those targets. And finally, it's a set of disclosure recommendations, and we are inspired by our sister organization and building directly on the same 4 pillars of disclosure recommendations that TCFD produced to recommend disclosures that every organization should make in order to have greater transparency on what we're doing. And to make all of this easy, to help businesses do this in practice, we're also developing additional guidance on technical areas like data, metrics, targets, and scenarios, and tailored guidance that's specific for particular sectors and for particular types of ecosystem biomes, so that what we produce is practical to implement.
So 2 follow-up questions for you, Andy. The first one is that I know that the tentative date, I guess, for the final release of the framework is September next year. So that's less than a year. Are we on track to meet that target? That's, I guess, the number 1 question. Then my second question to you is, you mentioned the TCFD. I know that some of our viewers may be more familiar with the TCFD than the TNFD. Can we, is it safe to expect the same level of adoption and success across jurisdiction and across sectors with the TNFD? What do you see so far?
Thank you. So yes, we are well on track for publishing in September next year. I think we have, by following an open innovation approach where we put material out regularly every 3 months, it's really kept us on track, kept us disciplined. So the framework is already mature and quite fully developed. Of course, there's always more one can do, but anyone attending this session can now go to the online framework website and see a pretty well-developed framework, and we'll do some final pieces for the March release, particularly a focus on disclosure metrics, which is kind of a final critical piece of the framework. But yes, so we're well on track, and we will definitely publish in September next year. In terms of linkages with TCFD, my sense from the level of interest that we're experiencing in the TNFD, not only from the market, from corporates and financial institutions, but also from regulators, supervisors, governments, is that there will be just as much uptake of TNFD as TCFD. What we're hearing from the market, of course, is the need for an integrated approach to sustainability reporting, which is why we work closely with the TCFD and are aligning with the global sustainability baseline being developed by the International Sustainability Standards Board, with the flexibility to go beyond that for organizations that wish to or are in jurisdictions where that would be required. So I think we're definitely seeing tremendous interest and uptake, and I'm excited about that maturing that will happen for an integrated sustainability approach that combines climate and nature over time.
Thanks, Emily, and I agree with you on the impressive level of interest that we're seeing. Just to kind of like give our viewers a glimpse of what's happening on the ground, every TNFD organized event are full to capacity with people standing. So I think that it's very safe to say that there's a lot of expectations from both the business and the financial institution community. My next question actually is to Magali. COP15, as we said, is taking place right now. What do you expect to get out of this conference, especially because Holcim has been doing a lot on the biodiversity side. So I'm guessing you already have your wish list and you came up with it in Montreal.
Thanks, Frank. Yes, I'm talking here from Montreal. It was great to listen to Ro before, because basically I could have said more or less the same. So it's fantastic to see this alignment, and great as well to listen to Emily. We are a member of the task force. Our head of nature, Renata, was in this famous panel you were talking about, Frank, just now, where the room was completely full of people, and we are fully supporting on that. I think, if we go back to what Emily just said, having a framework and having companies adopting the framework is absolutely crucial. And if I relate that to what's happening at the COP now, what we absolutely want is that the adoption in the target 15 of having large businesses, and we are one of them, so we want it, to assess and disclose their impact and dependencies on nature. I don't think it's such a big request, but target 15 was being negotiated yesterday. There was a lot of back and forth. We can't say we are there yet. There's a lot of different parties discussing different things. And like Rose said, I'm not sure all the businesses are aligned, but we are also a member of Business for Nature. And we are clearly wanting that because, as you said, we do a lot. I could explain how we measure nature, how we committed to improve our index on our impacts, etc. And we just would like more companies to come with us, because we're not going to do it alone. It's going to require unprecedented collaboration, and that won't happen without having a transparent disclosure on data. And today, I think it was Ro who talked about eDNA. There's many methodologies that exist. We hear so much about the data. We hear so many people talking about how they collect data on nature that I think the excuse of we don't know how to measure nature is becoming thinner and thinner. So it will be a moment where we won't be able to and as Holcim, we have gone and are measuring it. So, and I think the second big one for me, it's really the commitment and the mission to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. I think we just don't have a choice there. It's not even a question of a wish list or whatever. It's a question of, do we want the planet to still be livable for everything that's alive in 10 years or not? That's all it is about. And everything that is alive includes a human being, by the way. So, the planet will be very fine. Can I give a little anecdote that I heard at the COP27 from, it was Chatham household, so I can't say who said it, but I thought it was really, really good. It was a big famous scientist who was saying how sometimes they joke with their friends when they get a bit under too much stress and overwhelmed by everything. And you have this little blue planet who meets this little planet who is all dark and gray and horrible. And the little blue planet asks the little gray planet, what happened? Why are you looking so sad and so bad? Said, and the little gray planet answers, Homo sapiens. But don't worry, it passes.
Well, I hope we'll be able to figure it out before we get to that point. But thank you so much, Magali. Actually, I do have a follow-up question for you, particularly on what Holcim is doing in the space. You mentioned your index and kind of like how you're trying to improve it over time. Can you give us a bit more color on this?
Sure. So we developed in about 10 years ago with IUCN co-developed with Holcim something called BEARS. You know, we love acronyms in the biodiversity space. So BEARS means Biodiversity Indicator Reporting System, where basically we measure, and very complex because you basically have to measure every single insect, every single plant that you have in your ecosystem. And what we committed was that by 2024, we would have done the full baseline, again, because it takes time, and that indicator will move positively by 2030. So let me give you an example. The reason I aligned so much with what Rose said is because we have 900 quarries. So, you know, we are somehow a mining company making cement. And if you look at, they all have rehabilitation plans. It's legal in most countries, so you can't have a permit if you don't have a rehabilitation plan. If you do a rehabilitation plan by planting, I was told a story of one of our plants in Spain. The rehabilitation plan was about planting olive trees and another whatever trees, so 2 types of trees, and that was it. I mean, your biodiversity index is going to be pretty crap if you do that. So by having this commitment, we force our own operations, when they do the rehabilitation, to align with the local NGOs and do something where they bring back the native species, native plants, etc., which in terms of index will be way higher, and that's how we will be able to move our index positively. So that's in short what we are doing here.
No, I think that's very clear, and that can also be very inspiring for other companies as well, because that's something that is totally replicable. So thanks for that, Magali. I want to turn to Anthony. You know, we talked about a lot about the negative impact. We talked about how to mitigate it, but I also want to kind of talk about the other side of the conversation, which Emily hinted at, the dependency aspect. What are some of the dependencies your business has on nature, and what are some of the steps that you're taking to ensure their sustainable use?
Thank you, Frank. Let me, you know, the charm and the challenge of appearing late in the program like this. The charm is you have so many wise people who have gone before you, and I know more now than I did an hour ago about this very important issue. The challenge is where to begin, where to pick up on the conversation, because there are so many salient points. Let me preface my response to your question with maybe 2 elements, one as an individual and one as representing the institution that is Indorama. So first, you know, the idea of nature positive, of net positive impact on a personal level is actually very near and dear to me. I ran a TED talk on this, a TEDx talk that is over 10 years ago back in Canada. So I think it was I'm very pleased to see this come to this point where Ian Bremmer is talking about a 5-fold increase in the participation at COP, for example, the incredible interest around the TNFD and its release next year. And then, of course, as a Canadian, many of my fellow panelists are 500 kilometers away from my hometown. So I'm somewhat envious and at the same time feel connected to everyone who's there in Montreal. Indorama, I'm not sure how many people know, but thanks to Eurasia and to Suntory for inviting us to participate. You know, we're a petrochemical company listed on the Stock Exchange of Thailand, the largest producer of PET resin in the world, largest manufacturer, and also the largest recycler of PET for beverage bottle application. So although we were started here in Thailand 30 years ago, today we have 140 sites around 40 countries in the world. And what's interesting about Indorama is it's still run by the founding family. So the parents and the 3 children are very, very actively involved. And in fact, the parents just welcomed their 3rd grandchild into the family. And I share that because those family values, that sense of long-term sustainable value, it permeates everything that the company does. And, you know, I want to be frank in where Indorama stands in terms of our biodiversity journey. We're early. And I think what I'm hearing is that many of our peers, in fact, in the market are early, and we're definitely no exception to that. But, you know, will we have the commitment and the buy-in to support this? Absolutely. I have absolutely no doubt. And it's because, in large part, because what we've already done around sustainability, our commitments, our investments, and also those family values that actually underpin our activities. All right. So thanks for indulging me on that preface. To your question then, certainly, you know, impacts resources like water are very important to the products that we make and the customers that we serve. So of course, we have a water reduction target for 2025 and 2030. We have a number of sites looking at zero liquid discharge and so on. And that's an area that we are, it's a material input to our process, and also has an impact at the other end of our process. I think the broader areas around biodiversity, and there are many, in fact. We've done an initial assessment using the IBAT tool. We've looked at the IUCN data around species at risk and so on. So we're starting to have an understanding. We're not at the point, we're really at the assessing stage. In the Eurasia Suntory report, for example, you mentioned the 4 parts. We're really at that early first part. But I think that assessing stage has 2 components for us. So one is this materiality assessment, understanding where we stand. Not yet ready to set targets because we have to, I think, go further in our stance. And then the other one is, what are we already doing actually that has biodiversity impacts? So for example, we have a goal to recycle 50 billion bottles per year by 2025. To date, we've recycled about 83 billion bottles. So 50 billion per year, that's an ambitious target. That is impacting positively ocean plastic, waterways, plastic waste in general, as well as the other socioeconomic benefits of recycling. Just one example. We've secured sustainable finance is an area that's very important to us. We've secured $1.3 billion in sustainable finance to date. 300 million of that is something called a blue loan. So it was the first ever blue loan financed by the International Finance Corporation, the Asian Development Bank, and the German Development Bank. And that's to build recycling infrastructure in 5 developing countries, one in Latin America and the other 4 here in Asia. And just earlier today, I was speaking at an Asia Plastics Forum, and one of the messages I delivered was that Ian was talking about this in his opening remarks about the disproportionate impact here in Asia Pacific. I sit in Bangkok right now, and particularly in developing Asia. And we know the Paris Agreement 1.5 is the target, right? Well, a recent report showed where are the 3 major regions? Are they, how off track are they? And Europe is 2.4 degrees. That's the trajectory. North America is 2.5, 2.6, and Asia is 3 degrees. And I shared that very sobering message today with a number of plastics manufacturers, recyclers. So the inextricable link between climate and biodiversity, again, we would in this region suffer disproportionately. So all of that, I think, macro and more micro impacts are in our mindset and our frameworks. And then speaking of frameworks, we're one of the first companies in Thailand to produce a TCFD compliant report. So for sure, we'll be watching with interest Emily's progress. And Emily, would love to talk to you about a pilot, participating in some way and learning the process, because it's very much the spirit of Indorama. We're a very data-driven company. In fact, the first person I hired on my team when I joined was a data scientist. So we have the first ever data scientist in sustainability. And there's so much work for that person, eventually persons. And so I think, all this discussion around data disclosure, transparency, it's so fundamental. And the more we can understand what is measurable, what are the spheres, what are the common frameworks, I think that's why TNFD is getting such interest. I also take a lot of encouragement from that interest because it shows the maturity of the market. And, I stepped into sustainability by accident in Canada in 2001. And so today, to see that level of engagement and interest and curiosity shows really where we've come, the sort of mainstreaming of ESG, sustainability, climate, biodiversity. So we're very early in our journey, a strong appetite to actually engage and learn and get to those 2nd, 3rd, and 4th phases that you detail in your report. And I think our participation today and the connections that you have facilitated will help us move that needle. So thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm actually going to go to Emily because you especially mentioned in Anthony's remark how easy it is for companies to be part of the consultation process or to join the TNFD forum. Can you maybe speak to that process? Because I think it's very important for our viewers to understand that the TNFD is a business-led, is a market-led initiative. So can you walk us through that a little bit?
Well, first, thank you, Anthony. We definitely take up that offer to pilot test. Thank you so much. So we should reconnect and introduce you to the lead of our pilots program after this. Great to meet you and thanks for your interest. So yes, there are a number of ways that organizations can connect and support the TNFD. As I mentioned, where there is the TNFD forum, so any organization that supports the mission of the TNFD can join the forum. There is a very simple form you fill out to express interest. And that's a way that you can become closer to the task force. And as Magali said, Holcim is one of the members of the task force. So we do regular newsletters, we do readouts of our plenary meetings, we do updates of the working group's progress, because it's a market-led initiative with the task force at the center, organized around working groups. So they're the engine of the framework development. So that's level one. Please do join the TNFD forum as a way to be closer to understanding what we're doing and contributing to help the task force. The second is pilot testing. And we have a simple piloting guide on our website for organizations to understand what pilot testing would involve. And we have a number of pilot program partners like ICMM, and thanks to Ro for all your help, who have cohorts of pilot testers who are collaborating to share their insights from trying out the framework. And when you pilot test, we're very flexible. You don't have to do end-to-end every detail. You can scope it and be narrow and just do a nugget. We welcome any kind of feedback through pilot testing, so you can just get started and do it in a way that works for you. And also, there's not a commitment to have to make everything you do transparent. You can just share feedback from bilaterally with us and with yourselves. We want to grow interest and uptake. So join the TNFD forum. If you feel ready and interested, you can pilot test, and we're welcoming feedback from pilot testing by the 1st of June next year to give us time to incorporate it in September. And third and finally, you can also just give us feedback at any time, just reviewing sections. And that's why we have created an online platform where all elements of the framework are updated. And you can provide feedback via the survey or through little links on each page. So as you read something, you can give us your reactions in real time. So one of my roles is every 4 weeks, I consolidate the feedback we're receiving and feed it back to the task force so that they can receive that and update as we go. So 3 ways you can engage, and encourage you to do any and all of those to help the task force in its big job to finalize the framework next year.
Thank you so much, Emily. I do have a final question for Ro and Magali, and it's the exact same question. I want to know, Ro, lots of buzz around nature positive. Some people are saying that it might be the net zero in the biodiversity nature space. If there's no deal at the end of this conference, will it still continue? Do you still see this nature positive movement kind of like grow and evolve? And will the ICMM members still be part of it? And then same question very quickly to Magali.
Very quickly, Frank, of course it will continue to grow. If anything, it might strengthen. We saw that, with the climate movement, when a COP disappointed, those that were really committed, cities, companies, investors, actually ramped up and said, hang on, if the governments aren't going to do this, we're going to do it ourselves. The trouble is, if we leave here with nothing of significance, it will be messier, it will be slower, and it will make some of the leaders feel that their leadership actions could make them uncompetitive, and that could have a chilling effect. So we should do everything possible to leave here with a clear, comprehensive, ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework. But Frank, if that doesn't happen, I'm confident that leading companies and organizations, and I hope we can count ourselves in that, will absolutely continue to push the nature positive agenda forward. That's not going to stop.
Magali, do you agree?
I fully agree, but on the other hand, I don't want to say it, because if I say today, if the agreement doesn't happen, then we will continue doing it. I may be giving them a reason, or I'm releasing the pressure for the agreement to actually happen. So I'd rather say no. But yeah, I fully agree with Ro. Of course, we've been doing it before. Before any agreement, we've been completely at the forefront, and we're not going to stop because there's no agreement. But as Ro said, really, really it needs to happen. It just needs to happen.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Magali. Thank you, Ro. Thank you, Anthony, for joining this panel on how companies can become nature positive in the future and what are the tools that are available to make it happen. Really appreciate your time and comments today. We've covered a lot of ground with the 3 sessions that we've had back to back, and I'd like to bring back my colleague, Shari, now as we conclude this live stream. Shari, welcome back.
Frank, thanks so much. So I I thought that Magali's story of the 2 planets was really telling. And when I heard Ko talk about the 1/8 species of species facing extinction, I thought, well, if we go out long enough on our current pathway, that's going to be humans as well, right? But really what struck me in this whole conversation was the focus of companies and financiers. And it really feels like the awareness on biodiversity and how companies affect nature loss and how nature loss affects companies is getting sophisticated far more quickly than it did for climate. And the work on climate has clearly made a pathway, I think it accelerated this understanding. And it also makes this shorter runway for companies to start to get their systems and their strategies in place to start to address biodiversity and nature issues. What's your perception, Frank?
No, I mean, I totally agree with you, Shari. And if I were to compare it with COP27, the climate COP that took place in Sharm el-Sheikh just a few weeks ago, already there, biodiversity conversation were coming in and popping in left and right. So you kind of see that link and people really understanding that climate and biodiversity are 2 sides of the same coin. So it's kind of like, in a way, people realize, oh, if we want to reach those net zero targets, at some point we will have to play our role when it comes to the biodiversity agenda. And that really helped kind of like the conversation on the biodiversity side. And I was talking to members of the COP15 Secretariat, and they were telling me that between the end of COP27 and the beginning of COP15, they saw kind of like this massive spike of private sector organizations saying, we want to join, we want to be there, we want to have our own events, we want to share our new commitments. They were actually telling me that they had 4 times the amount of requests for side events than the number of rooms that they could accommodate at the conference venue. So in a way, what you're seeing in Montreal is that there's an on-site COP15 and an off-site COP15 with just as many events. For instance, a lot of the TNFD events are taking place off-site. So that interest is something that is very concrete. It is something that is growing exponentially. And it's something, as Ro and Magali said in the previous panel, will continue regardless, especially next year. I think that 2023 is going to be the year of biodiversity.
Right. And I think that also one of the things that strikes me is this understanding of how biodiversity is going to affect the bottom line, which changes the entire relationship of the companies inside of this dialogue, because it's no longer a uniform pushback against regulation, but an understanding, I think, in more than just a talky way, that if there's a regulation, it assists everybody moving, it standardizes movement, and it also helps the companies not be affected by the negative impacts of biodiversity loss and, climate loss.
I mean, it's all about how do you streamline policies, right? How do you make it in a way that everyone feels like they're moving in the same direction? Something that we cover a lot with the Eurasia Group in our kind of like policy coverage, and that really is the main question mark of the conference here. You think of Target 15, that is about mentoring policy across all levels of kind of like government. You think about Target 15, that is focusing on business disclosures, both on the impact side and on the dependency sides. Those are conversations that are very new, that are very different, and that are extremely encouraging in terms of what can happen next, regardless of the outcome.
Well, Frank, I'll be interested to see what your final conclusions are coming out of COP15. I know at Eurasia Group, we will be writing a lot about it. So I'll let you get back to it, Frank. And that concludes our program today. We'd like to thank Suntory Holdings, as well as all the members of the Sustainability Leaders Council for making this event possible. To see more live streams like this one, head to gzeromedia.com/events. I'm Shari Friedman, and for all of us at Eurasia Group and GZERO, thanks for watching and wishing you a great day.